Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We've called it Determining Seed Sources for Ground Cover Restoration, but I believe Joan has a slightly different title once we get started. My name is Karen Brown. I'm the Resource Specialist for the Longleaf Alliance. Today we're really happy to have Ms. Joan Walker with us to present on a subject she has a lot of experience and expertise with, the diversity of ground cover species in the longleaf ecosystem. Joan has been a botanist for the Forest Service, and as I understand it, the first botanist for the National Forests of Florida and for the Southeast region, which is really cool. She then became a research ecologist at the Forest Service's Southern Research Station. As a research ecologist, Joan applied ecological principles to studying a lot of management problems at different scales across the longleaf range. These ranged from developing silvicultural approaches to restoration, rare plant studies, and designing seed transfer zones for understory species. She has stayed very well connected with the longleaf world, longleaf management and managers since her retirement in 2018. She continues to teach in our longleaf academies, for one, and has guided the establishment of our ground cover restoration curriculum, and is currently serving on the board of the Longleaf Alliance. So thank you, Joan, for being with us today. I'm also joined by Jacob Barrett with the Longleaf Alliance. Jacob is a technical assistance and training specialist. He'll be helping out today, moderating the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we'd love to take your questions. Use that Q&A function on the bottom of your screen for questions directed towards Joan or towards the content of the webinar. We also have a chat function, so we'd love for you to introduce yourself there or share any other information or conversations can take place in the chat. So we'd love to see who's here, where you're coming from. This session is being recorded and it will be available for later viewing back on the webinar portal. That'll take just a couple days to get ready. Hopefully by the end of the week, that should be all ready to go. Joan, if you're ready to go, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Oops, excuse me. I am ready. Thank you very much for all of you who had the time and the interest to join us this afternoon. It is a topic I'm interested in. Continue to learn all sorts of stuff, even as I put together this talk this week. I did change the title somewhat to sourcing and acquiring plant materials. I wanted to broaden the context from seeds alone to include things like transplants, which of course start from seeds. And I wanted to include not just where the origin of that plant material would be, but how do you get it? And what are the advantages of different ways of getting it? So with that brief sort of caveat, I will proceed to tell you a little bit about, give you an outline of the talk, so what you can expect. I'm going to start out with a very general framework for this discussion of restoration. We'll proceed then to talk about which species do you choose for your restoration and the factors that enter into those decisions. Following on to then actually getting to the sourcing, where should the origins of plant materials be? Where can you get the seed or the plant materials? And do we really need to plant everything everywhere all at once? There are some things I will not talk about. I will not talk about how to put seeds on the ground or how to plant for success. That's a topic for another day. So just so you're not expecting site prep and those in management practices to implement a plan, not go in there today. So let me start a little bit about restoration. I think about restoration as, if we consider this blue circle here as a description of what was the original vegetation here. What did it look like? How did it work? And through time, it's been disturbed. And now we have conditions that could be described as degraded. The process of going from the degraded condition back to the original is simply the process of restoration. Now, restoration is not a one-step process. Very rarely can you identify what the problem was and then turn around, undo the problem, and make it go back to the original. So we picture some intermediate circles extending that progress from the degraded condition back to the original to suggest that it happens through time, and maybe there are actually management interventions that have to happen as we go. Now, I'm going to change some terms here a little bit and recognize that the causes of that disturbance in the Longleaf system are really strongly related to land use history. We'll consider this degraded condition, call it the starting point. The original condition or some sort of long-term restoration goal will be called the long-term goal or reference condition. And I've simplified that figure just now, removing some of the extra words to move forward and talk about a few key factors. One is land use history. First of all, talking about land use history and how it affects what's on the ground now and the conditions that are in place for the restoring that understory. Historical land use throughout the Southeast was really dominated by three major impacts. One being altered fire regimes, particularly fire exclusion. Second major sort of disturbance or change in management was for forest management, including things like plantation establishment and how you manage those plantations. And a third major area is agriculture, both tillage agriculture and animal husbandry. Of course, there's the disturbance of putting parking lots and houses in places, but won't talk about those are not likely to be restored in any case. So just a brief, some pictures here to suggest how general patterns of change with certain kinds of disturbance regimes. First of all, fire exclusion. You could expect there to be an increase in the canopy, in many cases, an increase in the forest floor, changing the conditions like less light, less access to mineral soil, and consequently a loss of a lot of species or a loss of vigor in those species that might have persisted. If we look down here about forest management practices, those kinds of sites that have a primary disturbance history of forest management are quite variable. One thing that is common is generally an increase in the density of trees. But other than that, things can vary with species, with things like site prep, the previous management, the use of fire, site quality, and the age of that plantation. In all cases, the understory ground cover has either been depleted or probably changed, though the species that are associated with the ground cover of the longleaf pine system, as you probably know, are long-lived, and some of them are pretty tough and can tough it out through a lot of changes. If we consider agricultural sites, they also, like forest management sites, are really variable, depending on how recently they were abandoned, the previous management. And I just note that the impacts of agriculture management are really long lasting. In this site, the biggest site in the middle, it has a signature of agricultural history in the absence of many of the bunch grasses and few species, but that has been abandoned for decades. The variability in the initial starting conditions really argues for you really need to do an initial site assessment to determine what species are still there that you might want to keep, which ones are missing, and perhaps help identify some problems that you might encounter as you plan to implement your ground cover restoration. I'd like to move on now and talk about reference condition. Um, the definition I'd provide here for reference condition is really as a description of a site in its historical condition. Now, it may have had a lot of different conditions through history, but it's usually considered as the condition prior to European settlement. Condition meaning what species were there, what was their abundance, how big were they, how often did fire happen or other kinds of disturbances, even what kind of animals and and wildlife species were present on a particular landscape. It allows for the existence of disturbance regimes like fire that were in place at the time of European settlement. And it can be approximated by the conditions today of our most natural existing sites, those that that the Nature Conservancy might want to preserve, for example. It's informed by a lot of different, both contemporary and historical data. The value of reference condition is that it can identify a list of species, sort of a list that you can choose from, which species are likely to survive, persist, and thrive in your restored site. As I mentioned, a lot of information can be used to describe a reference condition, both historic and contemporary information. For example, pictures, aerial images, historical accounts, including the early explorers, and even further back as part of paleoecological evidence, like tree ring history and charcoal presence. Ecological descriptions, species lists and maps of the project site prior to when it was degraded, if it's a recent change, and remnants of the site to be restored. There may be on the edges or around nearby relatively undisturbed sites that indicate the previous conditions in the biota. Ecological decisions and descriptions and species lists from similar intact systems like those nearby natural areas. As you can see from this list, both contemporary real-time information as well as information about history can provide an idea of what the reference condition could be, what might be the desirable long-term outcome of a relatively complete restoration. Information can come from the site that you're interested in, or it may come from by nearby sites or sites that are similar and not so near. But at any rate, the information that comes from places nearby in space and recently or nearby in time are the most reliable. Now, I want to make the distinction between reference condition and reference site. A reference condition is sort of hypothetical, or it is more inclusive, can have a lot of information. You may not be able to go to a reference condition, but you can go to a reference site. A reference site is an actual site where you could go to visit. It's representative of the reference condition, and they serve as benchmarks for can serve as benchmarks for evaluating the success. They are sites preferably nearby that have little evidence of human impact. They're relatively stable through time, and they are functioning, the best we know, as a healthy ecosystem. As I said, the best good things about this are they can give you a target, a visual target, or an idea of where to go and what species might be missing from the site, your target restoration site. But a really good thing about it is that you can go back and visit it many times. If background climates or things are changing, the reference site, they might predict or indicate that such similar changes you might expect in your restoration site. So they're a really good tool if you can find one. The benefits, you can monitor progress, comparing it to what your restoration site looks like compared to that reference site through time. It makes sure having a functioning reference site gives you ideas about how an integrated or functioning restored site should look. It informs restoration goals, both in composition as well as how it should function. The challenge lies in finding a suitable reference site. There's a lot of places on the landscape that have been messed up, and way fewer places that are available that give you that are good reference sites. And reference sites themselves are changing through time. For example, through changes in climate, or both cyclic and long-term changes. So it's a really good tool if you can find one. But the challenges are, sometimes it's really hard to find one. So if you don't have a reference site and you don't have good information that can describe the reference condition, there are some general patterns in the longleaf system that can help inform what species you might choose to add to your restoration project. There have been a number of ways of describing variation in the longleaf system across the region. Ecoregions have been defined as large areas on the landscape. The map on the, the map on the left shows ecoregions that were defined loosely on a system that was described by the Nature Conservancy. They describe areas that have similar climate, geology, soils, hydrology, topography, underlying variation at a very large scale. There are 6 major ecosystems that were recognized by Bob Peet, who's done a lot of work on the vegetation across the region in the longleaf pine system. He suggested that 6 ecoregions would describe the variation within the system. On the right, sorry. I'm a little dyslexic when it comes to right and left. There's a map of vegetation types. And these are general vegetation types loosely corresponding to the ecoregions that include some types that cover some of the major axes of variation in longleaf habitats: Piedmont montane, sandhills, Music coastal plain sites, flatwood sites, and then there are some other ones on this map. Within these large longleaf pine types, individual plant communities or smaller sites, embedded sites, vary with respect, and they vary along gradients of soils, hydrology, topography, and fire ecology. These factors will influence what the plant community might look like and how it might function on an individual site at a smaller scale than ecoregion. We might call these smaller scale variations plant communities. That is, plant communities that are reliably found together and repeatedly on the landscape. And this is a portrayal that describes 6 major types that vary from dry to wet in terms of hydrology, and corresponding, they vary from lower diversity to higher diversity, loosely corresponds to variation in hydrology. The xeric sand uplands have open soil, mineral soil available, low productivity, fewer species, but many rare species. Xeric sand uphills grading into subxeric sites, which would be subxeric sites grading, have typically bunch grasses, pretty rich understory, intermediate productivity, compared with silty uplands, which have higher concentrations of legumes, for example, and generally higher site productivity and a different suite of species. Some of the most unique areas communities are found in the clay and rocky uplands in the mountains in Piedmont. Flatwoods typically are found on the outer coastal plain, oftentimes described as having maybe a more of a woody understory. And finally, the wettest sites with the lowest tree densities, most open canopies, wettest soil, longest hydro periods would be maybe described as savannas. Each of these community types has a set of characteristic species, and those would provide a starting point to identify species that you may choose or desire to add to your restoration site. But of course, these are only small pictures. They don't tell you what's on your site. And in fact, the question always comes up, well, how do I tell what is the right natural community? I mean, what's my target? How do I know which community I'm aiming for? And that's a question that I don't think about very often because it's where I work. I've looked at a lot, I've thought about it a lot, I've read a lot. So it's one that I've had to pause and think about. And there's different ways to gather that information. If you are a bookish kind of person or a librarian kind of person, you might consult native plant manuals or wildflower books that are native that are similar, well, that are related to where your sites are. If you're a hiker and an outdoor person, you may have been to places that look relatively undisturbed. They look like the pictures of longleaf sites that you see in books. Those might be a good place to start. Perhaps the most reliable is actually, if you're uncertain, is to find your local plant expert and give a call. Many botanists and plant ecologists jump at the chance to go out in the woods and look around and think about the world. You might find those experts in local universities, state agencies that deal with heritage programs, conservation, or wildlife issues. Those tend to have a lot of people who know about understory and know about values for wildlife and the names of species in particular that might be appropriate for those for restoring wildlife habitat and wildlife resources. You may find federal partners, botanists, or even wildlife biologists in national parks or nearby Forest Service land that could be of help. And finally, I would point to the Longleaf Alliance, really an organization that has their fingers on the pulse of biodiversity in longleaf systems and know a lot of people. So reach out to the experts within the Longleaf Alliance and they can help point you in the right direction and find out what is the right natural community, which has a list of associated species to help you choose which species would be appropriate for your restoration project. But whatever your system, all those pictures that we looked at, the longleaf system is a dynamic system. It's got an open canopy. It's got a diverse understory with lots of fine fuels, and it's tied together. The overstory and the understory are connected through the function of fire. All of those sites, regardless of the plant community that is appropriate, all the longleaf sites had fire as part of that system. They vary by the type of fire, the frequency of fire, but in restoring your ground cover, it's really the fire function or the function of that ground layer in providing fuel is a really important factor to consider. So we talked about reference conditions and the ideal choice or model for restoration. But what if you don't want everything? Management goals can influence species selections. Goods and services are diverse. associated with longleaf are diverse. They maintain site productivity, fuels, wildlife habitat, aesthetics, biodiversity. You may choose in your restoration project to emphasize more or one or more of these, or ignore one or more of these, depending on your perspective. One way to look at how to meet those goals would be to consider the concept of functional groups. And those would be groups of species that play a shared role in the ecosystem. For example, warm season bunch grasses are important for fuels. They provide wildlife food and cover. They restore the soil. Legumes, as a group, are important for wildlife food and soil health. They don't necessarily provide a lot for fire or for structure, but they're really important function in maintaining the ecosystem integrity. And another group would be spring, summer, and fall flowering forbs. Many of them are the composites, and having them present at different times throughout the season support different kinds of pollinators and insectivores, and then the animals that eat those insectivores, insects, and small mammals. So these are kind of functional groups that, as you build or think about what do you want in your system, thinking about having these functional groups well represented somewhere on your system might be a good way to start building a species list. I wanted to just mention the term workhorse species. You may have heard it, I've heard it, and I actually had to look it up because this is one of those things that I took the time to look up. It's a word, it's a phrase or a description that's used most often among producers, and it's they represent species that are widely used, hence species that might be supporting values that a lot of people would like, for example, fuel. And from a grower's perspective, they're readily produced. And from a supply perspective, if you have a restoration project, you're likely to be able to find them. So I wanted to introduce this species because you're likely to hear it. And it may be also a way to think about talking to people who are producing seeds. Do you have workhorse species? I think about workhorse species as maybe also species that provide essential, pretty much essential functions, or essential, functions in the ecosystem that are important for its maintenance. Because so fire would be one of those, and so grasses would be one of those primary things that I would think be included in almost every restoration. Legumes perhaps as a sort of subgroup, in that they provide wildlife and other values and diversity values, but they also have a function in restoring soil fertility. So some of the diverse values, if you value wildlife or special wildlife like gopher tortoise, ground nesting birds, birds that you might hunt or species that you might hunt, whatever your values, those animals have particular habitat needs, food, cover, shelter. Those would also might be something you choose to add. Of course, the understory is known for the diversity of floral resources, for those who live off of nectar, for those who pollinate, and for those who eat pollen. You may choose to enrich your site with any of these kinds of species if you truly are trying to support those groups. And of course, you recognize monarchs, and just put this slide in as a reminder that they have both different requirements as adults or as larvae. And if you're focusing on one part of the life cycle, your restoration, you might want to include or choose to include species that support the whole cycle. So we've gotten to the point of saying which species, how current condition and an initial assessment would be valuable in helping us decide which species, knowing the reference condition, your management goals, and finally, the availability of plant materials might actually limit what you can put on your site. And some plants may not just be available for collection or for purchase. So we've progressed here through down to the topic of the origins of plant materials. And I want to talk about the need for ecologically suitable seed, or what is suitable for restoring longleaf communities. And ideally, we want plant materials that will thrive in that restoration project, and also plant materials that do not threaten any species or local species or populations that are already there. We want to be able to conserve the genetic resources of the understory species. The safe solution for this is to select seed sources from the closest possible location and collect from a site that physically matches the target site. This is really the conservative approach toward seed sourcing for restoration. Note that this has both a geographic component and a habitat component, that is close and similar habitat. Both of these assumptions, they're based on the assumption that populations or species are adapted to the conditions in which they were evolved. So those might be, and that actually populations that are closer to each other have had a shared evolutionary history, so they're likely to be more similar than those from far away, and that they would be able to survive the same environmental conditions or same climatic conditions. And that's a similar argument for adaptation to certain habitats. We have some species that have a broad habitat preference. It can be found in fairly mesic and productive sites, or they can dominate really dry sites and lower productivity sites. Those species may actually have slightly different genetic makeups and be adapted to specific habitat requirements that make them better likely to be more successful. So the idea of both a distance and a habitat component is something to keep in mind. Now, as we talked before, there are ecoregions that can describe the variation in the longleaf system at large scales. And this largely takes into account biogeographic variation and climatic variation. But local variation also in the longleaf system is subtle, but it controls diversity patterns, soil texture, moisture, availability, and nutrient, as I mentioned before when we talked about natural communities. I'd like the idea of local seed versus and ecotype seed. So let me start talking first about ecotype seeds. In some species, populations can be adapted to those special habitat conditions. Ecotypes are genetically fixed variations associated with habitat characteristics. If available, it is advisable to choose seed from ecotypes that match your site. Ecotype is actually sometimes also used, has a distance component. So even a sandhills that's nearby would be preferable to a sandhills somewhere else in the longleaf range. So that would be described as ecotype seed. Local seed has this distance component. Some species, however, are found across the longleaf range, and mirror sources are likely to be more successful. But it begs the question, how far can seeds be moved, or how local is local? And the answer to that is generally provided by the development of seed transfer zones. One more factor about the longleaf species distribution I want to mention is that throughout the Southeast, there are a lot of species that have very small distribution areas. And furthermore, there are areas where there are concentrations of what we call endemics or narrow endemics. One of these would be, for example, around the Apalachicola National Forest. The Atlantic Coastal Plain the Middle Atlantic Coastal Plain has species that the South Atlantic Coastal Plain does not, and the West Gulf Coastal Plain. There are species turnover here, and we wonder if those abrupt changes in species of narrow species might also reflect some genetic differences in even more widespread species. So let's talk about general seed zones a little bit. General seed zones are seed zones are generally considered to be areas or parts, units of area within which seeds or propagules can be moved around with reasonably good prediction of success. You may be familiar with USDA plant hardiness zones. They're based on climate. Other researchers and in other systems, people have considered ecoregions as a possible correlate of seed zones, suggesting that you could move seeds anywhere in an ecoregion and expect success. Others have actually combined ecoregions with climate, and the graph gets messier and messier. But very few of these studies have been done or tested in the Southeast for herbaceous species. So me at South Carolina and colleagues at the Joan Center recognize the need to do some development of seed zones with some actual plants. So in that light, we coordinated 2 research studies, one in South Carolina and one along the Gulf Coast, which I'll tell you about a little bit more so you understand how seed zones are developed and what they mean. Basically, developing a seed zone involves planting seeds from populations collected across a region of interest, putting them in a common garden and see how they grow. In addition to that, so if you plant them in a common garden, differences among populations with that environmental variation removed can tell us if there's differences in populations. It's not necessarily adaptation, but if there are differences in genetic sort of underlying genetics. Coupled with common garden experiments, there is possibility of putting gardens, not just one garden, but multiple gardens, and locating those gardens that in a way that represents the range of variation or geographic range of the area of interest. If populations are adapted to local conditions, individuals will perform better in a garden that's similar to their local environment than in some garden located far away. If there's no adaptation, then the relative performance of populations won't differ from garden to garden. So we developed some studies in South Carolina and in the Gulf Coast area that included both common gardens and reciprocal transplant gardens. The South Carolina project was initiated with a really simple question. Is it okay to use seed collected in South Carolina, anywhere in South Carolina? Can we use it anywhere else in the state in South Carolina in the right kind of habitat? The reason that was interesting and a question was because South Carolina is bisected by a well-known biogeographical disjunction called sometimes referred to as the wiregrass gap. North of that gap, northern wiregrass, a dominant species in many understories, longleaf understories, grows. South of that gap, we have southern wiregrass. Sometimes they're identified as separate species, and sometimes varieties of the same species, and sometimes people don't even recognize a difference. But there is a gap in that distribution. Our initial model that we were thinking about using as model seed zones were ecoregions. If we had an ecoregion that identified that gap, not all of them do, we would start with that as a model, saying maybe that's a good seed zone model. We found such a regionalization in ecoregion regionalization in the TNC map. They actually had a system of mapping that was designed to identify biodiversity. And they actually identified this break in the distribution in South Carolina. And we thought, okay, that's a good starting point. Now, the way that seed zone models are determined are that you collect a bunch of species, populations of a bunch of species within the range of interest. You look at how they perform in either common or reciprocal gardens. you look at the patterns of those performances, which species do well, which don't do well, and you say, how does that pattern align with the divisions that you propose as a seed zone border? To do this, you have to generally put up several models and see which model fits best. In South Carolina, we started with TNC ecoregions as the first model. We added some and so we identified seed zones based on that, potentially for the Middle Atlantic coastal plain, which is represented in this blue area, the South Atlantic coastal plain, south of the Wiregrass Gap. We identified also the possibility of a sandhills region, which is kind of a supplemental ecoregion type. We divided that to identify some alternative candidate seed zones. One is the simple division between Middle and South Atlantic coastal plains. The other recognized the sandhills as a third possible distinct seed zone unit. And then we also divided the sandhills north and south. So the research questions were, do candidate seed collection zones, those zones I just showed, explain differences in performance equally well? That is, performance of populations in common gardens. Is there any evidence of adaptation? That is, that the location of the garden matched with the location of the collection is better than if it was planted elsewhere. So I'm going to tell you some more about this study. We had to study multiple species. We included 3 grass species that are found in South Carolina, 2 legumes, Solidago odora, Pideopsis, and 2 legumes, some of the largest groups in the understory of most of the ground layer of many of longleaf pine communities. We collected populations of these. I think, let me just go back a second. All of these red areas indicate where we had seed collected populations. So we tried to cover the area from into North Carolina down to just into the border of Georgia. We grew these seeds. We had 8 to 10 populations for each species distributed across the range. We grew them up in a greenhouse and we outplanted them in 3 gardens. The gardens that we had were one in the Middle Atlantic coastal plain, one in the South Atlantic coastal plain, and one in the sandhills. This would allow us to look at comparative performance. We installed the gardens at Clemson Research and Education Centers. We measured response variables, which were traits that we thought would be related to success or performance in the planting area. For example, how fast did they grow? How big did they grow? When did they flower? Measures that were related to water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency. We analyzed all of these response data, and what we found were that patterns matched up with gardens in different ways, depending on which species you looked at and which trait you looked at. So there was no single emerging seed zone model that worked for all species all of the time. One thing that was a fairly robust finding was that northern populations of composites and legumes as well flowered earlier than southern populations. And notice we have a pretty narrow north-south distance, but it spanned that biogeographical boundary. We had 9 populations in the analysis for anise-scented goldenrod. The earliest flowers were in the more northern populations, as much as 6 weeks earlier than the southern populations. The similar patterns were found in the legumes. These 3 populations were the earliest flowering. the northern populations. The latest populations were found south of the Wiregrass Gap, and the ones in between were found at an intermediate time. This was a fairly robust and surprising finding. As I said, it held across legumes as well. And if we return to the research question, we basically found that for most species and most traits, this 2 ecoregion model explained the variation. And so we suggest that planting and moving things across those 2 zones may not matter. Things may survive those climatic differences, but there are probably differences in terms of the length of the growing season that might mess up coordinations or matches up with pollinators. The Gulf Coast Plain study was similar. It looked at variation starting in 2 models, starting with the TNC ecoregion model, as did the South Carolina study. That included 3 units on the left here: East Gulf Coast, South Atlantic Coastal Plain, and Florida Peninsula. Notice that this study was done at the same time as the South Carolina study, and it shared a common garden. So there was overlap here in methods and in timing and in species that we studied. The alternative model that this study used divided the East Gulf Coastal Plain into several subunits: the Western East Gulf, Central East Gulf, Eastern East Gulf, continued to recognize the South Atlantic Coastal Plain and Florida. Basically, they found really similar things, that the best model depended on, it was species specific. So what this is telling us, that there's no one seed zone model that's going to account for and protect the genetic variation in all species. There was some evidence for joining across multiple species, for joining the East Gulf Coast, the East Gulf Coast, and the South Gulf Coast species into a single unit. And that was a fairly strong recommendation. And so this results, like we found in South Carolina, were species and trait specific. Zones up to 250 to 300 miles, you could expect to move species east-west that distance and not have an effect. The biggest differences we found in both studies had to do with phenology. Now, this proposed model of east-west matches up pretty well with some of the proposed rule of thumb that's used in tallgrass prairie management, which suggests don't move species further north or south 100 miles or further east of west between 100 and 200 miles. So when we put these together, the current thinking about, or recommendations about safe seed zones, would recognize 6 zones: 1 north of the Wiregrass Gap, the east-west distribution of South Atlantic Coastal Plain, 3 in the East Coastal Plain, and 1 in Florida Peninsula. That's the current state of the research. Notice its limitations. We have no information in Virginia. We have no information about the West Gulf Coastal Plain. We have no information about the value or the possibility of moving seeds through the mountains or Piedmont longleaf. Factors that influence how much that matters are things like where you have to be really careful. Some characteristics of species would argue for local seed sources. For example, species that have just narrow distributions, species that have little long distance gene flow, like insect pollinated or gravity dispersed species, populations or species that were historically fragmented so that there may have been time for genetic differentiation. And if you have really high quality habitat, you might really want to focus on local sources. Where you could relax those distance requirements would be in widely distributed species, wind pollinated and wind dispersed, much like the common abundant grasses in the longleaf system, and highly disturbed or degraded system. Maybe the goal is just to get stuff in there no matter how far it comes away, as long as it's the right species. Okay. Yeah, a question that often comes up with seed sources is it okay to mix seed sources? And my own thinking, there are different ways of, people have tried all different ways and justified mixing seeds in all different ways. In this chart here, from strictly local to mixing across the range and across habitats, like really mixing a lot together. Some also even suggest mixing or planting species from what might be a site where the future climate represents the current climate. So planting for the future climate. I think my own mixing sources, just sort of as a general rule, changes the genetic makeup of populations. A source similar to the recipient site is going to maximize success for now. There might be mixing sources increases genetic diversity. In some cases, that might be desirable. My own thinking has evolved on this. I am thinking more about that maximizing, or at least maybe not maximizing, but allowing for some increase in genetic diversity in introduced populations may not be a bad thing. And my own thinking is still evolving on that. And one could argue it either way. So just as a brief sort of stop here, we have some provisional seed zones. Conservative sourcing is important for some species more than others. Using multiple seed sources is okay in the same project. And sometimes you have to take what you can get. Sometimes you just can't be choosy in terms of seed. So here we are. We've gone through the origins of plant materials, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where do you get your seed. And basically there's two options. You can collect your own or you can buy it. If you collect your own, it doesn't work everywhere. You need to have a suitable source available, preferably nearby similar environment, relatively undisturbed, and abundant desirable species. You have to have plenty of time to achieve your objectives, because you may not be able to get it all done in 1 year. You may not be able to get enough seed in 1 year if you are collecting it yourself and moving it directly from one site to another. And you need to account for some time to prepare the site, make sure that collection site is burned and there's going to be adequate seed. And ask yourself, do you have the equipment or the capability of collecting larger quantities? You can always collect by hand and distribute by hand, but that doesn't support large projects done in a short amount of time. And one of the benefits of this collecting your own model is that you know exactly where it came from. You know it's close, it should survive. And that's a good thing. Some of the things that are less desirable are the need for time and the need to do it, to collect and seed more than once, maybe, but also the uncertainty about the quality of seed unless you have the capability of testing seed, and the uncertainty of timing for planting and for collection and planting, both of which are easily overcome. A nice advantage is that if you're really interested in this kind of work, it's an opportunity to learn a lot and it's a lot of fun. But let's move on to looking, well, one sideline here. If you do your own collections, it's really important to record information about those collections. On the right of this picture, you see a collection data sheet that we used when we were collecting seeds for the seed zone study, common garden study. It included things like who collected it, and you need some identification number for that lot of seeds, include the species, the location, population information, like how big a population are you collecting from, how far apart are those species? How many individuals did you collect? What was the habitat? Are there other species present? And if you want to go back there, include the directions. This kind of information is really helpful when you get down the line and it was either a smashing success or a smashing failure, and you want to say, try to understand what went wrong or what went right. So if you collect, this is the kind of information that's helpful to interpret your outcome over time. Now, let's move on to purchasing your own seed. So what do seed producers really do? Well, these are some pictures that I borrowed from John Seymour of Brownstone Seeds, and I'm not making an advertisement for that seed producer. I just borrowed some slides from him. This is seed producers document where they collect. This gentleman is making plant specimens and has a notebook that says this seed lot, it came from this kind of species and it was collected at this time and place. These guys are collecting at the right time and place. They know their species. This was hand collection, but they also have the ability to collect larger quantities with mechanized ways. They collect the seed, they clean that seed, they grow it up in a greenhouse to produce seedlings that can be transplanted into a field where they can increase the production of seed in a small area, making it easier to collect pure seed and seed in abundance of an individual species. So this into seed increase field. So these are seedlings that were grown in a greenhouse. They're being planted here on the right by hand. There's also mechanized ways to plant. You grow them up, you make seed, you harvest them, bring them into a factory where they're cleaned and bagged up and ready for sale. Sign me up on the website. You can buy what you want, what they got for sale. But in addition to providing clean seed producers give you a lot more. Specifically, they give you information. A wealth of information has gone into growing and producing seed. I will mention one thing that's kind of a downside about production is that every step along the way, from collection to germination to growing in a greenhouse, can be a way of selecting for certain genotypes. It's like even in a diverse collection, some of those individuals may grow better in a greenhouse than others. Some may grow better in the field than others. So there is some argument against this kind of multi-step increase in production, but I haven't seen I haven't read a lot, but what I've seen, there's not a huge amount of concern about loss of diversity, especially in kinds of species that have a lot of diversity and overlapping diversity in all populations, like the grasses. So one of the kinds of information that seed producers give you when you buy seed has to do with how good is this seed? How much of the seed, when you buy a lot of stuff or a bag of stuff from a producer, it's not totally pure. They clean it pretty well, but you got to stop somewhere so you're not breaking up the seed. So one of the first things they do before bagging the seed is a purity test, just determining how much of a seed lot by weight is pure seed and how much of it is not, whether it's other kinds of seed or whether it's crud, litter that happens to get caught up with it. In this particular graph here on the left, it shows a result of a purity test of 95%. They also do then, in a certified lab, a germination test to determine how much of that pure seed is actually going to germinate, how much of it is alive. These two bits of information, the purity of the lot and the percentage and how much of it will germinate, is used to produce a statistic called pure live seed. Pure live seed is what you really want to buy. You don't care for the junk. You don't care for the things that are going to germinate. So if you purchase seed, be aware that you are purchasing seed based on pure live seed weight is different than purchasing seed based on bulk seed weight. An example here for the calculation of PLS would be if purity is 90%, which means that 90% of the weight is actual seed, and germination is 70%, pure live seed will be 60% of the weight of what you buy. What's on a label has information. It's more information that's provided when you buy seed. The species, the variety, sometimes it has a regional ecotype or variety. If you do not know what that means, ask the seed producer. Ask them where they collected it. If you have any uncertainty, they should know. If they don't know, it's not a good, reliable seed source for seed. PLS again will be given. Note here that this is a label from Roundstone Seed. It's a label from seed that I purchased. It's not an advertisement, but I will point out that the Longleaf Alliance website, if you go to the nursery tab, you will find the names of producers that have given results and that we are willing to have on the website as a reference. One other thing that producers give you that it's hard to get on your own are seed mixes. They can be standardized or made to order. This is an example from that has 3 species in it, a blue stem, lovegrass, and a black-eyed Susan. On this label, it tells you what is the pure seed, the purity. It gives you how much you would plant per acre. And that's based on number of seeds, and that has to do with seed weight. But these numbers are based on percentage by weight. We have PLS for each seed and information about germination and total viability and purity for all the species involved. Now, mixing seeds is a science. It has a lot of things that go into it. Think about if you had a seed mix that had a lot of grass seed in it and not so many rare seed species. If everything germinated and you grew all that grass up, that grass is providing a lot of competition for any of those rarer species. And so that balance between species is really important. There's need to know information about the number of seeds per the target number of seeds per pound, per square foot, the likelihood of seeds to germinate, the sizes of plants at maturity, and their aggressiveness. Will they outcompete each other? Will they, do they all happen at the same time? There's a lot of things that go into creating a seed mix likely to produce a diverse community over time. And that's way beyond my pay grade, but that in itself, if you're interested in introducing multiple species, talking to seed producers and producers of mixes is a really good thing. I recommend it. Everything everywhere all at once. Well, we've been talking about as if you would seed your whole restoration area or treat your whole restoration area the same with seed, based on what you see, what you want to get to. But remember, it's sort of the starting conditions are variable. And not only are they variable from site to site, but they're variable within a site. An initial site survey can tell you things like maybe there are patches of good native vegetation there, and you just want to supplement around those. Or maybe there are gaps in good vegetation that you want to enhance their recovery faster. Maybe it's missing a certain group of species. Maybe the legumes are missing, but you have grasses, or maybe some of the forbs are there, but you've lost the grasses for some reason. So there are options. It's not everything everywhere all at once. Overseeding an existing population is possible. And the possibility of enrichment planting is a distinct possibility if the rarer species or the species that occur one at a time, as opposed to in patches, adding those into an already somewhat functional landscape could, I think of that as enrichment planting. And seeds may not be the best way to do that. Maybe transplants will work perfectly well, especially if it's a more rare species. You could, again, think of this as using opportunities to fix small inclusions by adding gaps or establishing even sort of the inverse, establish islands of diversity and produce your own very local seed source. So sourcing for seed sourcing and how you use seeds or how you intend to use seeds could influence your choice between seeds or transplants. Seeds are probably the more economical for larger areas. They can be distributed and mimic nature in terms of the dispersal and establishment, and you can seed repeatedly. You have to allow time for germination, establishment, and growth, so it takes time, and there's high rates of loss for seedlings in nature. Plants and plugs, it's really would work in smaller areas for selected species, and you have an immediate impact. You want to plant an aesthetically beautiful system or community next to your front yard, plants and plugs could be the way to go. Cost more, and you may have to take care of those plants a while, but there's a high likelihood of success. So we have options for adding plant materials depending on your goals and starting conditions. Whew. Okay, so we've moved along through what species are possible, why you might choose some species, what's the origin of sites of species and plant material to collect or to buy, some considerations of how do you just treat part of a site. Covered a fair bit of ground, but I would like some final thoughts on just noting that species selection and sourcing material is really only a small part of planning and implementing a ground cover restoration. It's really important that you may pick all the right species, you may put them in the right places, but if you mess up and come in and don't have your project well sequenced or laid out, you may end up planting trees in your recently established longleaf understory and really compensating the success or putting at risk the success of your investment. So thinking about the timing of burning. When do you do that? If you're doing it for your trees, is it going to clash or be a bad time for burning for the understory? And when do you plant grasses and sedges and forbs compared to when do you plant trees? If you are thinning a canopy, a harvest could seriously impact all the work you've done in establishing the understory. So I just kind of want to end with that in mind, that this is just a small part of a really large and complex multi-step process, and encourage you to work to think it through from start to finish, and so that you can maximize your opportunities for success, meeting management goals, creating a sustainable, diverse, and functional longleaf understory. Good luck. And if there's any way that I can help, or please feel free to reach out to me. And at this time, I think we have time for a few questions.
Yep, we do have time for just a few. Thank you, Joan. That was great. That was really thorough and extremely informative. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so Joan, we have maybe 4 minutes before we have to wrap this up. So we'll pick a couple of questions maybe, but we did have one that came in about uncertainty for future climate, and that kind of spurred them on to collect seed from a wider seed collection area, 300 miles in every direction is what they said. But they're aware that they're making quote mutts and intergrades, but hopefully they're going to get some kind of hybrid vigor out of that. and increase in genetic diversity will help a new population be more resilient to whatever the climate morphs into over time. But was this your thinking on like mixed, when you were talking about mixed seed sources?
Yes, I actually, in terms of thinking about climate, I am in, especially for species with wide geographic ranges, and within population genetic diversity is high, and overlapping among populations, like in wind dispersed and wind pollinated plants like the grasses. I think the chances of messing up are less for those kinds of species than for things like the legumes and maybe some of the other forbs that are insect pollinated and may have more variability, that meaningful variability across populations. So, you know, I actually would do the same thing. I think the risk of messing up is not huge. I say that with some trepidation because I really need to do some more research on that. But it's the sourcing for the future is being done for trees and for long-lived perennials. Grasses and forbs have a shorter lifetime, or they reproduce sexually more frequently than trees and establish and grow. So the opportunities for recombination and adaptation through time, I think it's faster than for trees. And so maybe the risk of losing species is worth the chance of maximizing diversity of the outplanted population. So I would do it myself.
Sorry about that, on mute. But so thinking about moving plant species from, I think what this person's getting at is much further. But do you think that species moved north and south of their native site will adjust their flower and phenology to the new site over time?
No, I think that's really a problem, or could be a problem. Climate change, we are accustomed to thinking about changes in temperature extremes and rain and precipitation extremes. One of the things that plants respond to in terms of timing of flowering and is actually day length and some other environmental cues that aren't necessarily going to change in the same way that climate change. So plants may become can survive changes in the extreme, but if they're moved too far out of that window that's responsive to day length, for example, they may not be able to have the same flowering, and it may take generations. Maybe there will be some adaptation, but I don't know how fast that happens.
You're muted again.
Yeah, I keep doing that to myself. But I was just saying, thank you, Joan. We had a few more questions, but we've unfortunately ran out of time. So I'm going to toss it back to Karen for wrap up.
Thanks. Thanks, Joan, so much for sharing this information today. I think I know I got a lot out of it, and I've heard it before. And definitely something to keep in mind when planning ahead for restoration projects, really understanding the science behind some of the seed sources and a little bit more information in making those decisions. I think that's always helpful. I also wanted to thank the Wade Research Foundation for sponsoring today's talk. And thanks to all of you for joining us today at this late date in December. If you are seeking continuing education credits for today's webinar, we have a couple available. Please keep your browser open. It should return you back to the webinar portal to complete that credit step to see those on your record. So until next time, take care.
Thanks, everybody.